I didn't realize how much a person can shrink you without ever raising their voice. That slow drip of disrespect, it sneaks up on you. One day you're fine, and the next you catch yourself apologizing for things that aren't even your fault. That's where this all started for me. In the tiny moments I kept brushing off because I didn't want to make a scene. I work at a small landscaping company in my town. Nothing fancy, mostly lawn care and seasonal cleanups. It's steady, honest work. I like being outdoors, and I've always taken pride in doing things right, even if no one notices. That no one notices part became pretty literal when my coworker Rick joined the crew last spring. At first I thought he was just blunt. Some guys are. But the little digs started early. If I was trimming shrubs, he'd hover and mutter, "That's not how I'd do it." If I loaded the truck, he'd shift everything around like I was some rookie. He was older than me by maybe 10 years, and he liked reminding me of it with that smug grin, like he was doing me a favor by pointing out every mistake. I tried laughing it off. Everyone has quirks, right? But the comments kept coming, and they got sharper. If a customer complimented the yard, he'd jump in with a joke about how I finally got something right. He said it lightly, but the way he looked at me afterward, that sideways smirk, made it clear he meant it. The worst part was how quickly other people started accepting it. Our boss, Mike, chuckled at Rick's remarks like they were harmless. Even the newer seasonal guys followed his lead, watching me work like I needed constant correction. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I knew that. But when one person keeps framing you as incompetent, eventually the room shifts their weight in that direction. I'd go home tired, not from the physical work, but from replaying every moment of the day, wondering how one guy could make me doubt myself this much. I'd lie awake thinking, is this what it's going to be like every season? Am I really letting this dude rewrite who I am at work? The answer came one Friday afternoon when we were finishing a yard for a longtime customer, Mrs. Alden. She's sweet, always brings us lemonade, and she genuinely praises a job well done. When she walked over to thank us, she looked right at me and said how great the hedges looked this year. Before I could even smile, Rick cut in with, "Yeah, after I fixed his mess. Kids still can't keep a straight line." I hadn't messed up anything. In fact, he hadn't touched those hedges at all. But he said it so casually, so confidently, that Mrs. Alden's face shifted from warm to unsure. And for the first time, I saw her look at me the way everyone else had started to. That hit harder than anything he'd said before. On the drive back, Rick hummed like he hadn't just shoved me under the bus for fun. I sat there gripping the door handle, realizing something I should have seen months earlier. This wasn't going to stop. He wasn't joking. He wasn't teasing. He was building a version of me that made him look better. And I was letting him. That evening, I didn't vent, didn't complain, didn't try to explain myself to anyone. I just sat at my kitchen table, staring at a blank notebook page until one clear, solid thought settled in. I'm done letting this guy speak for me. After that afternoon with Mrs. Alden, something in me shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic, more like a quiet click inside my chest. I still showed up to work like normal, still kept my head down, but I stopped trying to win Rick over. I stopped making excuses for him in my mind. I just watched. And once I started paying attention, I saw the pattern clearly. Rick wasn't better than me at the job. He wasn't more skilled, more patient, or more knowledgeable. What he was, without question, was loud. Loud in his opinions. Loud in his criticisms. Loud in his need to be seen as the expert. The more I observed, the more obvious it became that he covered his mistakes by pointing fingers at others, especially me. One Monday, we were laying mulch for a new client. Rick kept disappearing behind the shed, talking on his phone. When Mike showed up unexpectedly, Rick rushed out and immediately started scolding me for slowing the whole job down, even though he was the one wandering off. Mike didn't question it. He just frowned at me like I was the problem again. It was like being stuck in a loop. I did the work, Rick took the credit or twisted it into something negative, and everyone accepted his version because he said it first and said it loudly. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. We were doing a full yard cleanup for a small apartment complex. It was a long job, hauling branches, power washing walkways, replacing a few dead shrubs. I handled most of the heavy lifting because Rick kept insisting he needed to coordinate with the property manager. He spent more time talking than working, but I swallowed my annoyance and pushed through the day. When the manager came out to check the final walkthrough, she complimented the cleanup. Before I could even nod, Rick jumped in and said, "Yeah, I had to redo most of his sections. He rushes through things, doesn't pay attention." He said it in front of everyone. The manager, the crew, and two tenants standing nearby. The worst part wasn't even the lie. It was the way people nodded, accepting it as a fact because they'd heard him say things like that so often. But what happened next finally snapped the last string. The manager asked us to trim a couple of bushes near the entrance. It was simple, quick, routine. But Rick nudged me and said, loudly enough for the manager to hear, "You sure you can handle that without screwing it up?" I felt my face burn. Not from shame, from anger. Hot, sharp anger that pulsed behind my ribs. I had never been talked to like that in my life. Not by a coworker, and definitely not in public. When I looked at the manager, I saw that same uneasy look Mrs. Alden had given me after Rick's last cheap shot. He was rewriting my reputation in real time, and people were buying it. I finished the trimming silently. Every movement felt tight, controlled. I refused to give him anything he could twist. When the day ended and we were loading up the truck, Rick threw one last comment over his shoulder. "Try not to drag the team down tomorrow, too." Something inside me went still. Not raging, not shaking, just still. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he wasn't powerful. He wasn't respected. He wasn't even liked. He was tolerated, and he was using me as a prop to keep himself elevated. I drove home in absolute silence, hands steady on the wheel, no replaying the moment, no self-doubt, just clarity settling in like dust after a storm. If Rick needed to tear me down to hold himself up, fine, but I wasn't going to let him do it anymore. That night, I opened that same notebook from the week before, drew a line across the page, and wrote 8 words that marked the start of everything that came next. Tomorrow, I stopped playing by his rules. The next day, I didn't confront Rick. I didn't snap, yell, or demand anything. That would have given him exactly what he wanted. A scene he could twist into proof that I was emotional or unprofessional. Instead, I showed up early, kept my head down, and started paying attention in a different way. Not to him, but to everyone else. If there was one thing Rick relied on, it was that nobody questioned his version of events. He talked fast and loud, and people accepted whatever he said first. So I decided to quietly remove that advantage. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. We were scheduled to do a big mulch job for a church property, a place with lots of foot traffic, meaning lots of eyes. Before we started, Mike handed Rick the task list. Rick barely skimmed it before shoving the clipboard at me. "Just don't mess anything up," he muttered. I didn't respond. I just tucked the clipboard under my arm and went to work. But this time, I checked off each section as I completed it. I took photos as I went, time-stamped and clear. Not because I was planning some dramatic takedown, but because I knew how Rick operated. If anything went wrong, he'd blame me. If everything went right, he'd take credit. The pictures and notes weren't revenge. They were insurance. Around noon, Rick vanished again to talk to the groundskeeper. That was his go-to excuse whenever he disappeared to make calls or sit in his truck scrolling on his phone. Sure enough, half an hour later, he reappeared complaining loudly that the mulch lines were crooked and that someone wasn't following basic instructions. He hadn't even looked at the area. When Mike arrived to check on us, Rick launched into his usual monologue about how he had to redo half the work I'd done. I let him talk. I didn't defend myself. I didn't interrupt. I just waited until Mike turned to me. Then calmly and without any attitude, I said, "I documented everything as I went today. Do you want to see it?" Rick's face changed immediately. A flicker of surprise, then irritation, then something closer to panic. Mike blinked. "Documented?" I handed him the clipboard and pulled up the photos on my phone. Every completed section, every step, all neat and time-stamped. The mulch lines, straight as an arrow. Shrubs trimmed evenly. Edges clean. Nothing sloppy, nothing rushed. For once, Rick had nothing to say. Mike didn't praise me. That's not the kind of guy he is. But he nodded slowly, and I watched something shift on his face. Doubt. Not toward me, but toward the person who'd been shaping the narrative for months. The rest of the day, Rick kept his distance. He didn't hover. He didn't criticize. He barely made eye contact. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. He realized I'd quietly taken away the one weapon he relied on, control of the story. But my plan wasn't finished. Over the next week, I documented everything. Not obsessively, just enough to keep a clear record of what work was mine, what errors were his, and how often he disappeared on the job. I didn't use the evidence. I didn't mention it. I just kept stacking it, brick by brick. Then came the moment that tied everything together. We were assigned to clean up a rental property before new tenants moved in. Rick was supposed to prune the smaller trees while I handled the yard clearing. Instead, he spent the morning arguing on the phone with someone about money he was owed. When the landlord arrived midday, Rick rushed over and immediately blamed me for the pruning not being done. This time, I didn't wait for anyone to ask. I said in the same calm tone, "Rick never touched the trees. He was on his phone most of the morning. I have the work log if you need details." The landlord's eyebrows rose. My crew looked over. Rick froze. And just like that, his illusion cracked right down the middle. Not because I embarrassed him, not because I exposed him loudly, but because he suddenly realized that every time he tried to twist the truth, I could quietly correct the record. Not with emotion, but with facts. And facts were something he couldn't shout over. That night when I got home, I sat at the same kitchen table and wrote one more line in my notebook. Tomorrow he finally answers for all of it. The shift didn't happen with fireworks or yelling. It was quieter than that, almost disappointingly so. But sometimes quiet hits harder because everyone hears it at once. The next morning, Mike called a crew meeting at the shop before we headed out. That almost never happened unless something big was going on. Rick showed up looking irritated, probably assuming someone else had messed up, and he'd get another chance to lecture the room. I stayed by the wall, hands in my pockets, heart steady. Mike started by talking about job performance and reliability. Pretty standard stuff. But then he looked directly at Rick and said, "I've noticed some inconsistencies the past few weeks." Rick snorted, ready to deflect. "If this is about him," Mike held up a hand. "I'm not finished." The room went silent. Mike explained that he'd been reviewing our recent jobs. He'd talked to a few clients, checked timestamps, compared what was reported to what was actually done. He didn't call it evidence, but that's exactly what it was. The quiet records I'd kept, paired with what customers remembered about who did what. It painted a very clear picture. Rick trying to pass off work he never did. Rick disappearing on jobs. Rick blaming mistakes on me, even when the records showed I wasn't anywhere near the task he complained about. And the big one, Rick claiming he fixed sections that were done perfectly the first time. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Rick tried to defend himself at first, but he fumbled every explanation. Without the ability to control the story, he looked small. All that swagger drained out when the room didn't automatically nod along, when no one laughed at his comments, when nobody backed him up. Mike didn't fire him on the spot, but he did something that hit Rick even harder. He reassigned responsibilities. From that day on, I was the one leading most of the jobs. I handled customer walkthroughs. I delegated tasks. And Rick, who spent months positioning himself as the expert, was put on basic labor until Mike could evaluate further. The look on Rick's face wasn't explosive. It was worse. It was the expression of a man realizing his own behavior had finally caught up to him. The fallout didn't stop there. Clients started requesting me by name. The seasonal guys asked me questions instead of turning to him. The same people who once accepted his stories now saw the cracks in all of them. Rick tried to keep up his old attitude for a while, but it didn't land anymore. When he made a snide comment, the crew didn't laugh. When he tried to correct me, no one backed him. When he drifted off to take long phone calls, Mike pulled him aside in full view of everyone. By the end of the season, he wasn't the loudest voice on the crew. He was just another guy who'd talked himself into a corner. As for me, life didn't magically change, but something in me settled. That constant knot of frustration that had lived in my chest for months finally loosened. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like I had to explain myself to people who weren't listening. I had spoken for myself, quietly, clearly, and in a way he couldn't twist. A few days before winter break, Mike pulled me aside. He told me he appreciated how I handled the situation professionally. That's as close to praise as he gets, but it meant something. He also said he wanted me to take on more responsibility next year, maybe even train the new hires. Walking to my truck that evening, I felt something simple and solid. Peace. Not the kind that comes from getting even. The kind that comes from finally standing up straight after being bent for too long. If there's one thing I learned from all of this, it's that disrespect doesn't always come crashing down like thunder. Sometimes it lands one small drop at a time, hoping you won't notice. And revenge, real revenge, doesn't always look like payback. Sometimes it's just pulling the curtain back and letting someone's own behavior speak louder than they ever could. In the end, Rick wasn't undone by me. He was undone by the truth.